And I also wanted to write something about why we've got all of these different accents
Hmm.
in England specifically, but in the UK. And yeah, that it's why we've got this tribalism, because people feel very strongly about their accents, and
Hmm.
they also feel very strongly about the people's accents. And we have all of these different connotations that go with accents. So, like I was saying, if you speak a truth in a particular accent, then it may be the case that you're less likely to be believed than if you speak it in a different one. So if you speak it in an accent which is closer to a standard, then people are more likely to um, respect your view, which is, I mean, it's shocking. It really is shocking.
Hmm.
But we do have we have lots of accents. It is tribal. People didn't move around very much. We had invasions from all over the place. We had chiefdoms, kings, regional kings, and so on. And I guess up until probably the 1950s, if you look at an accent map from the 1950s, and there's one of these in my book for which sound is it? Is it R, I think?
Hmm. It's the R,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, the roticity. And you compare that with a map from around 900, when we've had the Viking invasions. There are boundaries on those maps which match. So
Mm.
you can see that where there are areas of roticity and non-roticity in England, they match practically exactly with the areas that were settled by the Vikings or various Saxon tribes, or um, the people who were in Britain before the Saxons arrived, all of those different sorts of areas. So people just didn't really move around very much, which means you get this huge amount of loyalty
Hmm.
to a particular region, to a particular accent. You can identify who's in your social group because of the way that they speak. You know who the people are who are a threat because they sound different. And it's still something that is there today. It's there now. And
Hmm.
I mean, we had the Industrial Revolution, so we had lots of urban accents come along, and they were judged to be unattractive because they're kind of associated with manual work and all of this sort of thing, industrial manual work as opposed to farm work, which sounds very different. And also that the media hasn't helped because they perpetuate stereotypes.
Right.
And in one of my chapters, which is on professional and performance voices, I interview, among other people, a voice coach, who basically says, if a film or a British film or a television program decides they want somebody who's kind of funny but untrustworthy, they will pick somebody with a particular accent
Interesting.
because of the connotations. Yeah, so we do have these connotations, and it's largely because of the history of the way that things developed. And so I mean, my suggestion is that with received pronunciation, it's a social accent, because it's not, although we tend to think of it as people from kind of posh people from London, that sort of area.
Right.
Actually, it's an accent which is all over the UK, spoken by upper class people. So there are people in Scotland who have RP accents, people in Ireland, Northern Ireland and Ireland, that have RP accents, people in various different places in England that have RP accents, in Wales that have RP accents, and so on. So the accent is a social accent rather than a regional
Right.
one.
Interesting.
And my suggestion for this is that, because it's associated with elites, that it's something that may have its genesis in the Norman invasions, because the only people that sort of travelled around the country were people that had the money to do so, and they tended to be royalty and people who were in a position to govern areas. And so you'd get these, and most of them were French speaking. So you had an entirely different language that was spoken by these people. But then eventually, as educated elites, usually educated at public schools, and again, because you have the money for it, then we've got this accent that arises in the kind of, I don't know, it's public school pronunciation. That's what Daniel Jones called it. So certainly, you know, by the beginning of the 20th century, you've got this accent, and then we hear it on things like the news, on the radio, and so on. And people who have this accent are considered to be authoritative because they're wealthy and they govern and they're justices of peace and all this sort of thing. So you end up with that kind of accent. So so I wanted to write about that stuff, and I wanted to write about my personal experience of it. And so I pitched this idea. It's actually David Crystal who put me in touch with a commissioning editor from Oxford University Press. And I pitched this idea, and she said the way that I pitched it was a bit too personal. So I could have elements of my story in there, and there are elements of my story in there, but also I should make it more sort of general about the population of England, rather than, you know, focusing so much on myself. So there's kind of bits of me in there, experiences that I've had that speak to certain things, like the fact that if somebody if a male speaker has a low-pitched voice, you assume that they are large.
There's a funny, I don't want to spoil the fun here, but there's a very funny story in the book, and I think you were talking about like a colleague that you said that his voice didn't really match his.
Yeah, no, it was a boyfriend of mine at the time. Yeah, so there's a story where
Are we allowed to talk about that story, Jane? Like, is he going to be?
Yeah, no, it's
okay?
fine. Yeah, I haven't been in touch with him for ages, so nobody needs to know who he is. But yeah, it was. I was at college, and I had a boyfriend at the time who had a particular sort of voice. His very, very low pitched voice, and I was on the phone to this the boyfriend. And one of my friends came along and sort of grabbed the phone off me at one point and was kind of talking to them. And they were speaking back. And then she was like, I see. Okay. It sounds really sexy, sort of thing. And so I okay. You know, so later on, I showed her a picture of the boyfriend. This is when we had photos. I was like, this is him. And she's like,
right.
Well, what are you expecting? You know, I think he's very sexy. It's clearly not her type, but you know, just by the person's voice, she was expecting this kind of rugby player type, you know, American football, huge bloke with big, you know, tall and all this sort of thing. He was quite tall actually, but he was quite sort of lanky and not particularly physically built, broad-shouldered or anything like that. And she was expecting something very different from the way that this person spoke. And yeah, I mean, there's another story in there about I can't remember. I think it's Ronnie Cray. So the Cray twins were a notorious a couple of gang leaders, if you like, in London. And an actor was talking about having to portray one of the brothers on screen. And he went and spoke to this brother in prison, and he said he was really surprised because the criminal chap had a really high-pitched voice and he wasn't expecting it. And you can't, you expect somebody who's sort of criminal has this really sort of gruff sounding voice like that, and apparently he's very high pitched. So we see people and we have expectations about how they're going to sound.
Where do those
come
from?
We hear people and we have expectations of how they're going to look. So it's really interesting how the voice.
No, sorry, Jane, go ahead.
Go on.
Where does that come from? Is that a cultural prejudice? Is that a historical prejudice? Going back to what you're saying about the Vikings, is that something that just from the media? Like, where do we get that?
I think it's physical. I mean, it may well be something from the media, but I think it's physical as well, because the larger you are, the more likely. I mean, clearly not that, but the more likely you are to have a large larynx. And if you're a male speaker and you have a large larynx, then you're going to have a lower voice. So we kind of it's often the case that large, tall, broad people have lower pitched voices purely from a physical point of view. But you know, everyone's different, and it's not the case that this is going to be what happens for everybody. But we see
Right.
somebody and we sort of assume that they're going to sound a particular way just by looking at them physically, and it's
Right.
yeah, it's fascinating.
Very
And
interesting.
there've been studies which have shown, I think this was something that was done with American high school students, where they had a group of students that listened to, I can't remember exactly what the study was, but they had a group of students that listened to some speakers, and they were shown images of the speakers. And if they were shown images of a white person, they were more likely to say they were intelligible than if they were shown images of somebody who was clearly not a white Caucasian,
Right.
person. So we see people or we hear people, and we automatically have expectations about them, and all of that stuff. We get really interesting effects if we mix it up and try to see how people are perceived. So yeah, so there's some of that in there as well.